All right, hello everybody. Today I am talking about a book called The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. This is a book that was, I think, first published in 1895, and since then it's been a very famous book. It's basically a loosely connected selection of short stories with a kind of an overarching plot. It's an interesting format. It's not something that you see every day. And parts of this book show up in anthologies very frequently. Arthur Machen is a very famous writer. I've actually had the Three Impostors on my list for a long time, but rather recently, another author named Stephen Sinclair has dropped a couple of comments on various videos, and he's quoted Arthur Machen a couple of times, so I thought, well, maybe I should move this up in the queue and give it a look. Now, the version I read was a version of the book that was republished by Ballantine Books in 1972 with an introduction by Lynn Carter. This book includes The Red Hand, but I'm not going to include that in this review. Maybe I'll do a separate review on The Red Hand later. But the place that I first heard about this book was from the supernatural horror and literature book by H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a big fan of Arthur Machen, and you know, perhaps this wasn't the best place to start reading Arthur Machen. I'll admit that. There are, at least according to Lovecraft, there are other works by Machen that are more, that are just better in general. They do what they're trying to do more effectively. This book in particular is actually mentioned with mixed feelings by Lovecraft in his essay, where he says it is a work whose merit, where he says, quote, "It is a work whose merit as a whole is somewhat marred by an imitation of the jaunty Stevenson manner." And by Stevenson, he's referring to Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote a book in 1882 called New Arabian Nights, kind of a modern rethinking or re-envisioning of that old, A Thousand Tales of the Arabian Nights kind of story, which I haven't read. Maybe it goes on the list as well. But Lovecraft also notes that this book contains, quote, "certain tales which perhaps represent the high watermark of Machen's skill as a terror weaver," end quote. So while this book has its ups, while this book has its downs, as an example of Arthur Machen's work, it also has some of the best ups of Arthur Machen's work as well, at least according to Lovecraft. So, we don't always get to see an author. The first book that you read of an author isn't always necessarily their best book, right? Sometimes you read one book by an author that is a mediocre book of their stuff, and it gets you into some of their better stuff, and you find their better stuff later on. Authors don't always get to make the best first impression on every reader. So I don't feel too bad about picking The Three Impostors to read as my first, significant look at Arthur Machen. And I don't regret reading the book either. It was quite good. So, what can I say? What can I say about this book that is kind of general and not spoilery? Well, as I said, it's a kind of a loosely connected set of relatively short tales with 5 main characters. If I wanted to oversimplify things, I could say that there are 2 good guys, whose names are Dyson and Phillips, and 3 bad guys, who are the 3 impostors. The weird stories are driven by strange coincidences. Dyson and Phillips basically end up meeting these 3 bad guy characters. One of them's a woman, but I'll continue to just call them bad guys. In turn, one at a time in turn, and the bad guys, the imposters, tell each of them these stories as to why they're trying to do what they're trying to do, and the reason for why they're trying to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish, and then to try to enlist Dyson and Phillips as helpers, basically. Long story short, and without spoiling anything, they're looking for someone, and they want other people, to include Dyson and Phillips, to let them know if they happen to see this one particular guy. The version I read includes 2 stories that are often dropped out of the collection called The Three Impostors. Those two stories are The Decorative Imagination and Novel of the Iron Maid. So when Lynn Carter wrote an introduction to this edition of the book, he wrote that he doesn't really know why they're omitted. It may even be that Arthur Machen wanted them omitted from the book for some particular reason that has been lost to time. Certainly that's possible. But he says, on the other hand, that he loves the book so much that he chose to include these two kind of orphaned stories. Nevertheless, he likes the book so much that he wanted to give the full honors to Machen that that Lynn Carter thought Machen deserved. And so we'll give him that. So now that we've kind of given an idea of kind of the overview of the book, let's talk about style. Machen's style is surprisingly challenging compared to a lot of the stuff that I've read, from recommendations in Lovecraft's supernatural horror essay, right? He has very long descriptions, a lot of very uncommon words. One word that he uses a couple of times is cedern, and it's one of those words where it's not technically context because he doesn't give like another sentence that allows you to tell what cedern means. But then you look at the word cedern and you're like, well, it must mean something like having to do with cedar trees. And that was my guess, and my guess was basically correct. But again, there's other examples, but I thought that was the most significant one, at least for me. We have also a stylistic choice are huge paragraphs. And Lovecraft does this too, so I'm not going to dock too many points, so to speak, for it. But the way that this book is written, it really requires constant attention to detail, because not only are there these descriptions where some small little bit of it is important, there are also these sudden jumps in perspective that honestly led me to some confusion as I was first reading the book. And to be fair, this might be intentional on Machen's part. In the prologue, so it's not spoilers if it's in the first 2 pages, right? In the prologue, Machen suddenly switches from the perspective of the three impostors over to Dyson and Phillips, and he does this in such a way that it's like that if you're not paying close attention to the text, you might miss it. And the other thing that happens is, kind of alongside, is that a lot of different names are getting dropped here and there. And so it's almost like, you've got 6 different names being given to you, and then suddenly there's 2 more that appear. And, unless you're paying careful attention, you say, oh, these 2 names must be associated with the other 6, when it's actually not the case. They're 2 completely different characters. I would say that the frequent long descriptions in the book are very good at building atmosphere. They're very detailed, and they use a lot of carefully chosen language. I would even say that sometimes they kind of range on the flowery. I'll give you an example. Quote, "Above the faded house on the hillside began the great forest, a long dark line seen from the opposing hills, stretching above the river for many a mile from north to south, and yielding in the north to even wilder country, barren and savage hills and ragged common land, a territory all strange and unvisited, and more unknown to Englishmen than the very heart of Africa. The space of a couple of steep fields alone separated the house from the wood, and the children were delighted to follow me up the long alleys of undergrowth, between smooth pleached walls of shining beech, to the highest point in the wood, whence one looked on one side across the river and the rise and fall of the country to the great western mountain wall, and on the other over the surge and dip of the myriad trees of the forest, over level meadows and the shining yellow sea to the faint coast beyond." Now, as you can tell from my reading of it, it's kind of a mouthful, but, I've seen authors try this kind of flowery writing and fail, but in this case, I think Machen actually succeeds. There's often details in these descriptions that give you not just that give you multiple senses kind of understanding of the setting or of the description of a character. And while they can be a little long, they are effective and they are well written. And if you actually sit down to kind of go through them and be careful to actually read them, they're actually quite, well, what would I say? Like they're composed well, I guess. There's a little bit of a poetic aspect to them. And it's not just that Arthur Machen describes, vistas in very detailed ways. He also has these descriptions of places and people that can be quite creepy at times. There is I believe a doctor or a Mr. Matthias in one of the stories who Machen describes this way, quote, "He was a man who would sit silent in an armchair for hours, neither reading nor smoking, but now and again moistening his lips with his tongue, and smiling queerly to himself." end quote. So, kind of this is a good, effective way to describe a person with kind of a creepy personality, kind of a weird, isolated, but also, like, self-stimulating personality. Like he kind of sits in a chair and laughs to himself. And he's, this is the character who's making this description is describing Matthias's actions in the particular club that they share. So, Machen's tone is very deeply literary. It is, lots of, how do I put it? There's definitely a lot of effort placed in making the prose flow well and sound interesting and it's one of those things where, as a modern reader, my attention span is probably a little bit lower than it ought to be. And so sometimes I had a little trouble not parsing, but a little trouble kind of keeping my place on the page. But when I did, I was always rewarded with excellent descriptions and, developments of action and such things like that. There are a lot of sections that take on almost like a journal-esque tone. And so you get that kind of tone that a person has when writing only for himself, if that makes sense. It can be frank and not necessarily like it's intended to entertain, but rather that it's intended to take down notes or to solidify information about something that a person has experienced, something strange or nerve-wracking that someone has experienced, and we get a lot of that in this book as well. One of the things I saw in people writing about this book is that there's a hint of detectiveness in Dyson, and I didn't really see it until someone pointed it out to me. There's a couple of sentences where Dyson refers to himself, in sort of like this detective-esque way, but in reality, the story is not. If the story were trying to be a detective story, I would say that it wouldn't. It's not a very good one, or not a very effective detective story. The elements of the detection of the detectiveness are just not there in large enough quantities to justify that kind of classification, I would say. There's certainly still mystery in the story, but the point of a detective story is that ideally the reader and some character or characters are trying to actively solve the mystery, or in some cases, a character or characters are trying to solve the mystery, and the reader might be left a little bit off to the side. Those are both types of detective stories. In this book, no one's ever really trying to solve the mystery, because the mystery, so to speak, is well known to the imposters and so coincidentally connected to Dyson and Phillips that they don't really see it as a problem for them to solve, if that makes sense. One thing that this book does a lot that I found very interesting is it kind of tries to blur the line between like superstition and science, right? Dyson is a man of letters, as the book describes him, and so he's kind of a little bit pompous, and he's very kind of wordy, and he's willing to look upon things with credibility that maybe they don't deserve, right? Phillips, on the other hand, is very much a scientific kind of mind, but at the same time, he has a weakness that Dyson points out in him, is that if you wrap nonsense in a scientific garb, Phillips suddenly becomes very credible about it, right? The point is made that things like hypnotism are are a scientific garb around various types of what you would call like mind control or something like that from a non-scientific perspective. In fact, there's a great line in the book that says, quote, "Give superstition a Greek name and believe in it. Should almost be a proverb," end quote. And that's referring to the ability to take something weird and maybe not very well justified by realistic scientific inquiry, give it a Greek name, and suddenly a bunch of people start to believe in it again. And of course, at the time that Machen was writing, there was a lot of this kind of stuff going on. We had, mesmerism and things like that, where, pseudoscientific things were masquerading as scientific in order to give themselves a veil of authenticity, if not legitimacy. So, as for the individual parts, or you might call them short stories that make up this book, they range from the relatively mundane to great escapes and terrifying body horror. There's a lot going on here, and there's this consistently growing... A lot of the stories have a very good tension curve, if that makes sense. They start out fairly mundane, and then some things slowly build and build and build until there's a peak of tension. Some of the stories do this very well. At the same time, the overall plot that kind of connects the different short stories together, the different individual parts together, also has, also has its own kind of tension, a meta tension, if you will, where, the reader is like, well, is this going to lead to something that is going to cause, these two opposing groups of characters to meet and have a conflict with each other? How's that going to come out in the end? And so you get this consistent sense of tension from the interactions between Dyson and Phillips and the Three Impostors, and that tension grows effectively very well as their interactions increase. You kind of keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. There's something darkly humorous about how Dyson and Phillips keep meeting these three people. And, you'd think that in a lot of stories, that would be engineered, but in this case it doesn't actually seem like it's engineered. There are some common aspects here and there where there are connections, but the threads are very thin, and if the threads were thicker, you'd almost worry more, because it would mean that there'd be more danger to Dyson and Phillips. The pacing of the book is, I would say, fairly slow, fairly sedate. Part of the issue is that the very long descriptions of things, the flowery, poetic language, has a tendency to make things kind of drag on longer than other authors might do. But, of course, when the pacing needs to rise up, Machen does his job and moves things faster and more frantically when that's appropriate. One literary thing that I learned from this book is that there are repeated references to something called a Milesian tale, or Milesian tales. And what this is it's an old name for Greek and Roman literature that collected stories with different narrators, very much like this book. However, the original Milesian tales, from what historians know about it, often had a bit of a salacious nature to them, whereas the stories in this particular book do not. So I think we'll call the general thoughts there, and we'll move on to the spoiler section, and I'll see you there. All right, let's get into the spoilers. So, as I've done before with stories that are kind of arranged in this kind of way, I'm going to talk a little bit about each individual short story, give a little bit of detail. Hopefully I won't spoil anything too significant that would prevent you from wanting to read the book. But, this will be here for people who have already read the book to kind of get a little bit more detail, I guess. So, this book starts out with a prologue. We see three characters leaving a house, and they're having a very odd conversation with each other. There seems to be something sinister going on, but among the things that we get from them are a series of names and a series of descriptions of each of these three characters. One is described as a clean-shaven man. Another one is described as kind of a vulgar-looking man with a ginger mustache going into basically a goatee. Another one is a woman with shining hazel eyes. So we see these three characters, and of course these are our three imposters. As they walk away from this abandoned house, or seemingly abandoned house, then the perspective switches suddenly. We move to a perspective from Dyson and Phillips' point of view, and they're walking up to the house, which appears to be abandoned to them. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the non-spoiler section is that there are so many names thrown out in such a short time in this prologue that I actually had to do a double take to realize the point of view switch had happened. My first glance was thinking that Dyson and Phillips were names of two of the three people who had left the house, but then I saw that they were going back to the house, and I was like, oh, what happened here? I missed a couple of sentences where the where the point of view change was made more was described, and so it's one of those things where starting for the prologue, this was already rather demanding of my attention to actually get it right, and I wonder if this was not done intentionally to kind of create this kind of discomfort in the reader, this impression that trickery and confusion are going to be a significant part of the book. Perhaps they were. I suspect they were. So, already I'm a little bit uneasy just reading the prologue of this book, because already it's kind of shifting things around in ways that are a little bit hard to follow. And so now I'm locked in, I'm paying attention, and I move on to the next story, which is The Adventure of the Gold Tiberius. Now, this is the inciting incident for the book, and we get more thorough introductions of Dyson and Phillips here. Dyson is kind of more wordy, and the prologue describes him as pompous, whereas Phillips is scientific, but will kind of believe things in a scientific garb. I already talked about that. Now, in this particular short story, Dyson tells Phillips kind of doesn't believe that strange things happen, right? He kind of has this idea of stuff is just normal, and everybody's days are just normal. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's kind of the impression that Dyson has of Phillips. And Dyson has this story to tell Phillips. He's like, this thing happened to me yesterday, and this thing is crazy. Listen to this. And he describes that he was kind of basically walking down the street at night, and suddenly a man dashed out, threw a thing, and Dyson went to look and see what the thing that he threw, and then he kind of heard another man running, hid in the shadows, and saw another man walk by with a knife in his hand. And what Dyson found, what the guy threw, was a weird gold coin. And this is a gold coin that, by coincidence, that Phillips has heard of. And so Phillips is like, oh, this coin is blah, 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 blah. And what this story does is it creates a very good sense of imminent danger for Dyson and Phillips. It establishes them as kind of the protagonists of the story, and it gives us the tension of this strange occurrence, and then it says to you as the reader, like, hey, if certain people find out about this coin and that Dyson has it, things are going to get very, very bad very quickly, or they very well might. So, already we get, this is the point where what I called earlier the meta tension of the story is like established, right? It's like, oh, this could be very, very bad, and so we need to watch out for the possibility of it getting very bad. So there's that. And then, once Dyson and Phillips have had this conversation, they kind of both go their separate ways, and we move on to the next short story. Okay, the next short story is called The Encounter of the Pavement. And in this short story, Dyson meets Wilkins. Wilkins is one of the imposters, and Machen is never careful, never hides the fact that these are the imposters, right? He always uses one line to describe the person that Dyson or Phillips is talking to that he used in the prologue to describe the three imposters. So that part's not really a spoiler, or it's not designed to be a matter of question, right? So Dyson meets this guy calling himself Wilkins, and Wilkins is chasing after a spectacled man. Dyson tries to help, and he kind of says, I don't want to give too much of the details, but basically Dyson says, the guy got away on a carriage, do you want to tell me about it, and maybe I can help you out? So they go to a cafe, and Dyson decides to listen to this guy Wilkins' story. And that begins, and this is kind of how things go where the narrator switches, kind of the Milesian Tales reference. Because here, the POV switches over to Wilkins, where Wilkins tells us the novel of the Dark Valley. Wilkins tells a tale of kind of becoming the secretary for a man named Smith, who he claims is the spectacled man. And then Smith takes him to this remote mountain this remote mountainside in America, and basically they both get nearly lynched. It's a very well-told story with a very mundane beginning that gradually rises the tension and confusion, and kind of shows us the effect of this kind of misunderstanding and how a bad actor can engineer this kind of misunderstanding to his own advantage. There is some weird occult stuff that suggests some kind of organization, maybe of like assassins or some kind of magical right to trade a person's life for gold kind of thing. This story, the novel of the Dark Valley, is excellent, even as a standalone. Like, if you didn't have the rest of the book, this is still a really good short story on its own. There are some really good descriptions of, like, the places that they're at, and the character reactions to Wilkins, in this story are also really fun to kind of watch and see how things kind of gradually build up in an odd way. After the novel of the Dark Valley ends, we move on to The Adventure of the Missing Brother, in which we switch over to Philip's point of view. He meets the woman, imposter, who says that her brother is lost. She kind of gives this weird explanation that she saw him walking with a man who had like the easiest description I can give is that the man had the hands of a zombie, decayed and rotting kind of things. And of course, as we've now started to come to expect, her description of her brother, the person she's looking for, matches the spectacled man that Wilkins already described previously. It's, this story is kind of just a lead up, right? These stories where the imposter talks to Dyson or Phillips is usually just a lead up, and this one has some interesting little kind of creepy aspects to it. But at this point, since we're kind of getting the idea of the structure of the story, we have a little bit more skepticism as a reader, and we're like, oh, she's not necessarily to be trusted. But basically, Phillips wants to help her as well, and he's like, well, tell me about what's going on, and maybe I can help you figure out, where your brother went, or where this man who was with your brother went, and so she goes into the novel of the Black Seal. So she recalls her tragic history with poverty and, living in the, deep country of England, and her difficulty in finding work in the city, even though she's trying to, go to the city to actually make some money and support herself. And then she finds work suddenly with this Professor Gregg. She goes to a remote spot of England with him, and she's kind of working as his secretary. Now, what this story does that's kind of cool is it mixes kind of the weird, creepy occult stuff with Old English or Welsh mythology. There's ideas of like the little people, right, the Fey folk, and them mixing with humans. There's legends of there's real legends of like changelings and stuff like that, where a baby gets switched out for the baby of one of these goblins or demons or ogres or whatever. We end up with this mystery that is attached to this strange black stone seal that has 60 letters on it, and that mystery kind of links up with the supposed disappearance of this Professor Gregg. This story, of course, Machen was writing before Lovecraft, of course. That's why Lovecraft was so inspired by Machen. But this story in particular might be, is extremely Lovecraftian if we give up on order of operations, right? We have a lot of long paragraphs. We have a very journal style. We have a very interesting mixture of the mundane and the supernatural. And even the description of the supernatural creature that appears seems to have inspired some of Lovecraft's imagery. I'll leave it at that. This time, however, in this particular story, the tension rises much more dramatically after a fairly long stretch of rather relaxed reading. The whole part about her being in poverty and looking for work and stuff goes on for quite a while. And, I wouldn't say that there's a lot of, like, dramatic tension necessarily. Clearly she's going to have to find some work, but clearly if she's here telling the story, she succeeded at some point, and so her talking about how she wasn't able to be a governess or whatever is not particularly, spooky or scary or terrifying. This story, what it does actually is it ends with a point of view switch back to Phillips. And Phillips goes home after talking with this woman. He's like, well, if I see the spectacled man, I'll let you know, kind of thing. And then he goes back home and he starts writing an article that I think is actually foreshadowing for a later tale, but it's also kind of something that her tale to him could have inspired. So it's kind of got that dual aspect to it, which I found kind of neat. The next part of the story is called The Incident of the Private Bar. We're back to Dyson, and he meets with this traveling salesman type while he's on a walk. The traveling salesman type is described as clean-shaven, as one of the imposters was. And Dyson invites this guy to his house. And here's where, like, if you're really paying attention, the tension kind of goes up a notch, because right now one of the three imposters is in Dyson's house. So this Burton guy, this traveling salesman, is curious about Dyson's statement that he's kind of just talking to himself, walking around, mentioning the spectacled man. Dyson has spent some time looking for Wilkins, and he spent some time looking for the spectacled man for Wilkins. And so he's kind of talking to himself as he walks, and the Burton guy is like, spectacled man, whiskers, I better talk with this guy. What ends up happening is that Burton says that the spectacled man is a former business associate who's avoiding him, and so Burton's looking for the spectacled man, just like everybody else. And what ends up happening is that since there's not really much to be gained at Dyson's house, Burton basically tells him a story about a few adventures that he has in foreign lands. And he talks about getting his hands, through rather unscrupulous means, on some rare jewels. These stories are not distinguished by separate titles, which is interesting, because a lot of the other stories are done so. But what ends up happening is a kind of an interesting discussion about like business ethics between Dyson and Burton. There's a little clever sophistry in there as well that again shows you that trickery and confusion and kind of getting your argument right and using a little trick here and there is something that Machen is willing to do, just like Burton is. So, I kind of find this particular story interesting because the imposter character is so forthright about being a bit of a snake or a cheat, and he kind of admits that he's chasing the spectacled man to get some kind of, in the dueling sense, satisfaction, right, if you will. At this point, all three imposters have now made contact with either or both of Dyson or Phillips. And so tension is now rising, as you wonder, as the reader, whether the issue of the Tiberius will be disclosed. It might be that Dyson or Phillips says something accidentally that exposes the fact that they have that Dyson has the Tiberius. But, you don't know at this point, and so now the tension kind of ratchets up a bit. These three imposters are clearly interacting with our two main characters, more prominently than coincidence would suggest. Burton then leads into a story called The Decorative Imagination. This is a preface for another tale from Burton to Dyson at some later date. And what happens in this little short thing is the theme of decadence arises, which is a common theme in Lovecraft's work as well. We also get some hints of Arabian Nights. The quote that I have here is this, quote, "Before us is unfolded the greatest spectacle the world has ever seen, the mystery of the innumerable ending streets, the strange adventures that must infallibly arise from so complicated a press of interests." Now this sounds like kind of a modern English prologue or preface or foreword or whatever you want to call it for something that would be like a modern Arabian Nights. And so, we kind of get a feel for that. And, they have their little discussion, but then Dyson kind of tells, "Hey, Burton, tell me another story." And so Burton goes into the novel of the Iron Maid. This is another short one. It's less eldritch than some of these other stories, but it's more kind of about the dangers of carelessness. And this, I think, is another clever element to rise that tension and the meta-tension of the overall story together and kind of ratchet them up a little bit. If you're not careful, you might die. It's basically a story with this creepy description of Matthias that I put in the non-spoiler section, and basically he buys a thing, which is like a torture device from ancient times, and I'll leave it there. It's a neat little story, but it's very short, and there's not a whole lot of creepiness to it. It's rather matter of fact, and so I can kind of understand why the Decorative Imagination and the novel of the Iron Maid have been left out of some copies. The story is a little bit more tightly woven and a little bit more kind of Cthulhu creepy or more timely. A more timely reference would be like the King in Yellow creepy, right? So I don't know. I'm glad that these two stories were put back into the book by what's his name, Lynn Carter. But at the same time, I can kind of see why maybe they've been dropped as well, because they're shorter and they have a slightly different kind of atmosphere to them. If you take it that. So the next story is The Recluse of Bayswater, and we're with Dyson again, but now Dyson is meeting up with the female imposter. Dyson goes to meet a friend of his named Russell, and in the same house, a young lady, the imposter lady, has taken a room on the first floor. When Dyson goes to meet Russell, he talks with him for a while, and then as he's leaving, she kind of beckons to him, and she's wearing a veil, and she complains of being chased by these, men who have it in for her, who, of course, are the spectacled man, or led by the spectacled man, or whatever. But she goes into another story, the novel of the white powder. And this is another tale that Lovecraft really enjoyed. He talks about this whole book for a couple of paragraphs in that essay, but of this particular short story, he enjoyed it very much. He says, quote, it, quote, approaches the absolute culmination of loathsome fright, end quote. It's a tale of this woman's brother, who is kind of an eccentric man. He kind of is sitting in his study and studying law, and he's never leaving the house at all. And so his health kind of starts to deteriorate, and he gets a prescription for a white powder that he's supposed to basically put in some water and drink it once a day. And I don't want to spoil too much of the story because it's really good the way that it escalates gradually. But as he takes this powder over a longer period of time, he eventually has to replenish his supply of the powder. And in replenishing his supply, something happens. Something happens that changes with the powder that he's now getting from getting a new supply, and changes with him as well. There's a very good pervasive sense of dread and some good body horror as well in this story. And the body horror is so severe that one of the characters in the story, this doctor, basically decides to leave England forever. Quote, I have sold my practice, he began, and tomorrow I am sailing on a long voyage. I do not know whether I shall ever return to England. In all probability, I shall buy a little land in California and settle there for the remainder of my life. I have brought you this packet, which you may open and read when you feel able to do so. It contains the report of Dr. Chambers on what I submitted to him. Goodbye, Miss Lester. Goodbye, end quote. So we get some more references to occult stuff, and it's kind of hard to figure out how this Dr. Chambers and the other doctor who was saying the thing actually came up with his conclusion about the powder. That's kind of a little bit of an open question in the story that I found a little bit hard to kind of lock into the facts as we know them. How would his colleague know? How would he know this either? It leaves an open question, which is, I would say, the weakest point of the story, but at the same time, the rest of the story is so good with the rising tension and the body horror and the very kind of occult elements that I kind of want to give it a pass for that. At the end of her telling her story of the novel of the white powder, the woman imposter tells Dyson that the man chasing her is a spectacled man. I said that already, but actually it comes after the story, so whatever. Anyway. Next up we have Strange Occurrence in Clerkenwell, where Dyson is again walking around, talking to himself, going into random taverns and stuff, and he sits down for a drink, and who should he see but the spectacled man himself, sitting at the bar. And then what happens is that Dyson is sitting there, far away off in the corner, kind of looking on at the spectacled man, and he sees the man that he identifies as Burton touch the spectacled man on the arm, and the spectacled man freaks out. And it's like, Mr. Davies, please, mercy, or something like that. And so now there's actually some more confusion going on. He's calling this Burton guy Davies, at least according to Dyson's perspective. And what happens is that the spectacled man drops a notebook. Dyson picks up the book on his way out of the bar. He kind of, coughs and pretends he drops his pipe, picks up the book and goes out, and he starts to read the book, which leads us to our next short story. This next short story is called History of the Young Man with Spectacles, and it kind of is the element that ties the spectacled man to the imposters. It's a tale of, falling in, being in desperate straits and falling in with a strange group that seems kind of like an organized crime group. They have knowledge of things that they ought not to have knowledge of, and they're doing these secret things to kind of move stuff around or get stuff for their own aggrandizement, I guess you would say. What happens is that the spectacled man was supposed to get this Tiberius that Dyson happens to have to a Dr. Lipsius. But what happens is he makes a discovery about Lipsius's organization that kind of is a bridge too far for him. He steals the coin, and he runs together. This ends up tying together the main plot because, well, the next story is the last one. The next and final story is Adventure of the Deserted Residence. We are back to roughly the time of the prologue. Phillips and Dyson are walking around, and Dyson is kind of taking Phillips out further away from the center of London, and he's starting to see the larger houses, the more green, stuff like that. What they find is the abandoned house from the prologue, and they go and discover what's within. In this story, we get an abrupt end to the story overall, to the book as a whole. And I was actually surprised that the two threads of the main plot didn't really kind of tie together here. We don't get a confrontation between the imposters and Dyson and Phillips. They miss each other, basically. Which I guess maybe was fodder for a continuation, but at the same time, Dyson knows now that he shouldn't tell anybody about the Tiberius, and so does Phillips. So, maybe not? I don't know. It's weird because all that meta-tension that's been building through the whole book kind of dissolves in an instant, where you're like, oh, but nothing that Dyson and Phillips said. I don't want to spoil too much of it, in case someone's reading this who hasn't, or watching this who hasn't read the whole thing. But I did find it a bit of a jarring ending, so I'll put it that way. Now, and to be fair, when you have a story, often ending it is the hardest part. Coming up with a good way to tie everything together is something that is difficult to, and maybe Machen didn't want to for some reason. We've seen a lot of confusion, pointed at the reader, I think deliberately by Machen. So I think that perhaps this somewhat of an anticlimax of an ending might have been intentional to show that kind of a humorous cap on things, to show that not every conspiracy ends in the culmination of what the conspirators wanted. I don't know. So that's kind of how the book ends, and that's what I thought of it. So from here we'll move on to the conclusion, and we'll finish this rather long review. In conclusion, once I got into the amount of attention that I needed to pay to this book, I really enjoyed it. Some of the novels are very, very good. And, the connecting thread little short stories are often intriguing, and there's often something interesting in them, a little nugget of something for the reader to think about. I was a little bit disappointed at the abruptness of the ending, but, and I also kind of thought that the coincidental repeated meetings of Dyson and Phillips with the imposters was a little too plot convenient, if you could think of it that way. I said it before, I haven't read Stevenson's New Arabian Nights, or I haven't read any other Machen, so, I can't exactly say how this book compares to other Machen works, but, I enjoyed it, and I found it interesting and well-written and descriptive and even a little poetic. I mean, it was once I locked in to the degree that I needed to lock in, it was a fun book, if a bit challenging at times, but sometimes a challenge is welcome, too. You need to kind of build your attention span a little bit here and there. I would say that if you're interested in those who influenced Lovecraft, or just if you want a unique and well-written story with with a lot of different aspects all over the place, and some very good kind of, mystery and horror aspects to it, definitely worth a read. You won't be disappointed. You'll have to lock in a little bit to, depending on whether how your attention span compares to mine, you may have to lock in a little bit or not, but, that's up to you. But if you're the kind of person that likes to sit down with a book and not really think about it, not really pay attention to it, but really just kind of flow through it, you might find this one a little bit disappointing. Just because you aren't giving it, and there are perfectly good reasons to read books, have light reading for fun, right? But this is not light reading. And so I'll say that if you are in the mood for light reading, probably you want to look for something a little different. But yeah, The Three Impostors, very good story. My first taste of Arthur Machen's writing, and liked it a lot. So yeah, that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and have a good rest of your week. See ya!